care about human rights?
Well, the role of business is to do business, but as business goes about its business, it ought not to harm individuals and communities. It's a basic social expectation that business respect the dignity of people they interact with. Similarly, governments have a role to make sure that labor laws and consumer protection laws and so forth are enforced.
What is the UN's Protect, Respect, and Remedy framework?
It clearly specifies the respective roles of governments and business and doesn't try to get the two mixed up. What the advocacy community sometimes does is to lay on business itself all manner of responsibilities for social outcomes, including things that governments ought to be doing. And what this framework does, as I say, is to clearly differentiate the respective roles of businesses and governments and make sure that they both play those roles.
Together with the UN, the OECD is one of the international bodies that set out guidelines for how businesses should behave when investing abroad. Does CSR pay? Early in this presentation, it was stated that corporations who have strong CSR policies integrated within their core business strategies actually outperform their competitors. This is due in part to consumer pressure and their interest in purchasing from companies who they believe to be operating ethically. In a pilot project in Bangladesh, BSR is working with Levi Strauss, Abercrombie & Fitch, and Timberland, and local NGOs to improve women's health in Asian factories. BSR says this project makes sound business sense, as both the women and the businesses are benefiting. For example, for every US dollar spent on women's health, one Bangladeshi factory has seen a $3 return on investment through higher productivity, lower turnover, and reduced absenteeism. So by working cooperatively, everyone in the supply chain benefits. Once again, here's Professor Heel.
It's a very interesting experiment that was carried out 2 years ago here in Manhattan by two guys from Harvard. I don't know how many of you know ABC Homes and Carpets. Okay, it's a somewhat upmarket department store down on 19th and Broadway. So here's the experiment that was done, just very briefly. ABC was selling two competing ranges of towels. And these were both made in developing countries, as are most towels today. They were both, it happens, made of organic cotton, and they were both made under fair trade conditions, which means that the sort of labour conditions were carefully monitored and certified to be reasonable. But none of these towels were labelled that they were organic, and none of them were labelled that they were fair trade. So what these two guys from Harvard did was they persuaded the management of ABC Homes and Carpets and carried the following experiment. They labelled one set of carpets, one set of towels, as organic and fair trade, and they didn't label the others. Okay, and then they went to watch what happens to sales. And the sales of the ones that were labelled organic and fair trade immediately went up by 25%, and the sales of the others dropped. So consumers showed a very strong preference for buying the ones that were labelled as fair trade and organic as opposed to the others. They kept that position for a month, and they raised the prices on the ones that were labelled fair trade and organic. First of all, they raised them 10% and kept them 10% up per month, and the sales didn't drop off at all. So they were now selling 25% more at a 10% higher price. They then raised the price another 10% for a total increase of 20%. Sales dropped off slightly, but only 1 or 2%. So they were actually making a lot more money because they were selling 25% more at about, let's say 23% more now at about a 20% higher price. They then took the labels away completely, left the towels for a number of months, and then completely reversed the experiment and put the labels on the other side of the other set of towels and found exactly the same thing happened again. So it was a very interesting experiment. It showed that consumers, at least some consumers, are willing to pay a significant amount extra for goods that they believe are produced in an environmentally and socially benign fashion. That's the issue of globalization. Another very important issue, perhaps in some ways the most important, is the rise of non-governmental organizations. And this is obviously part and parcel of the same process, and the rise of consumer activism. non-governmental organisations, civil society, monitor corporate actions very carefully in social and environmental fields, both in this country and in third world countries. And if they find these to be inappropriate, they're extremely vocal about this, to the extent of organising boycotts, which can often be quite costly for the companies that are targets of those boycotts. And consumers, at the same time, are increasingly interested in the provenance of the goods that they buy. They want to know not only what exactly am I buying, but what's the social footprint of this good that I'm buying, and what's child labour used in making this good, what's the environmental footprint of this good, how much is the CO2 footprint, and so on. So consumers are increasingly interested in this. I'll mention that more later on. And non-governmental organisations are quite aggressive in monitoring corporate behaviour. And because consumers are interested in these issues, the non-governmental organisations, if they publicise transgressions, can have an impact on consumer choices. A very clear example of that, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, back in 1997, Nike was found to be using subcontractors in China who employed child labour. It was the first, I guess, widely publicised case of a major Western corporation being responsible for child labour. Then, if you look at Nike's quarterly income statements, the impact, there's a strong consumer reaction to this, and attempts to boycott Nike products. And if you look at Nike's quarterly income statements that they're filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the impact of Nike sales on their top line was quite sharp, and their revenues dropped by about 20% over a couple of quarters. At a time when their competitor sales were increasing. So it wasn't a downturn in the market, it was a downturn in Nike sales because of the consumer boycott. A 20% drop is enough to have a big impact on profits in sort of business. So that was quite costly. And Nike had really sort of swung around on a dime and have become very aggressive practitioners of socially responsible behaviour in a number of respects, and I'll talk a bit more about that later.
In his book, When Principles Pay, Corporate Social Responsibility and the Bottom Line, Professor Heal discusses the advantages to companies who voluntarily choose to over-comply when it comes to their CSR decisions.
What I argue in the book is that there are in fact a number of financial benefits to companies from this kind of over-compliance, going beyond what is legally required of them on environmental and social issues. One is risk management. You can avoid, but doing this type of thing, you can avoid lawsuits. There's actually a very interesting, if you just look on that side, there's a very interesting analyst report, is that companies are doing things that they're not being required to do legally. Nobody is requiring Starbucks legally to purchase shape-ground coffee. It's a decision they've made on their own. There's no legal requirement on Nike that it implement higher standards at its subcontractors or that monitor those. There's no legal requirement at all on Citibank and Bank of America that they comply with the Equator Principles. Not only is there no legal requirement, but there's not even any prospect of any legal requirement because the US government couldn't, for example, legislate to govern Citibank's conduct in West Africa. They're voluntarily assuming responsibilities which could not be forced on them legally in the social and environmental area in most of these cases.